Well, the Most High be praised. Welcome to Voice of Messiah Ministries, and we're grateful for each and every one of you who has chosen to tune in and to listen to us again. Today, we're going to be continuing in part 3 of our subject on how to keep the Sabbath. I do want to update those who might be watching for the first time regarding the things that we covered in parts 1 and part 2. In our previous sections that we dealt with a number of subtopics. Today we're going to be dealing with the last subtopic, which has to do with permitted work on the Sabbath. And the previous subtopics that we covered primarily had to do with looking at how one views the Sabbath, such as regarding the holiness of the Sabbath. We discussed some things regarding the holiness of the Sabbath, because when a person looks at the concept of the Sabbath, it's important to recognize its sacredness. Also, we discussed the set-apart nature of the Sabbath, and that we treat the Sabbath as a special day, recognizing that it is a day that has been set apart from all of the other days of the week, because when the Most High created the Sabbath, he said that this day would be hallowed or set apart or made holy. And so what we began to notice about the Sabbath is that the Sabbath is special. It is different from all of the other days of the week, that seventh day. Also, we talked about the Torah-based prohibitions with regard to the Sabbath. The Torah gives some prohibitions when it comes to keeping the Sabbath. Some of those prohibitions that we talked about, of course, most people know no laborious work on the Sabbath. But also, there were some prohibitions that had to do with not lighting a fire on the Sabbath. And so we talked about that. Also, that there's to be no cooking on the Sabbath, which is related to, there again, the not lighting a fire, so that meals are prepared in advance. We also talked about treating the world as if the world keeps the Sabbath. We talked about that subtopic because it was important that we understand that the Sabbath was made initially for the human race. Messiah made a statement where he said that the Sabbath was made for man. The Greek word is anthropon, which refers to all of humanity. And so since the Sabbath was made for all of humanity, and it was made at the beginning, made for Adam, made for his descendants, which is the whole human race, then we find that the intent of the Creator, our Heavenly Father, is that the Sabbath be made for man, and that man is to enjoy and to respect the Sabbath. So we talked about treating the world as if the world kept the Sabbath. And when we talked about that, we dealt with the fact that animals were not to work on the Sabbath. That was a part of the guidelines with regard to it, that servants are supposed to rest on the Sabbath. We talked about that. We talked about that there's no buying and selling, no business activities on the Sabbath. And we referred to Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 15 through 22, that dealt with how the gates of Jerusalem were closed so that merchants would not come in on the Sabbath to tempt the Israelites at that time from buying on the Sabbath. Also, we talked about the fact that the messianic kingdom of Messiah, when that comes, it hasn't come yet, but when Messiah comes and he rules on his throne in Jerusalem, the scripture says that all flesh shall come to Jerusalem from Sabbath to Sabbath to worship the Most High Elohim. And so we find here that we look at treating the world as though the world is keeping the Sabbath. Now, we want to look at permitted work on the Sabbath. We touched on last week the fact that the worship and the religious activities that are done on the Sabbath are not seen as breaking the Sabbath. In Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 and 10, it discusses that the priests are to continue to perform their daily sacrifices, which the Most High had required out of them, to bring a lamb in the morning and a lamb in the evening, to also bring the grain offering that's to be poured, and also the hin of wine or the drink offering. This was to be done as a meal to the Most High in the morning and in the evening, and all of the other prescribed offerings. And these were to be done on the Sabbath. So anyone knows anything about the preparing of an animal, slaughtering of the animal, the putting the animal upon the altar, it takes work to do that. But because these were activities that were part of the worship to the Most High, these are permitted on the Sabbath. Also, Messiah Yeshua made a statement. I'm going to go to this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 5, which confirms Numbers 28, 9, and 10. Matthew 12, the fifth verse. And I just want to read this because it's important that we have scriptural evidence showing the continuity of the fact that there are certain things that are permitted on the Sabbath. And as we understand what Torah says with regard to Sabbath and the guidelines for those who are not serving in the aspects of worship to the Most High, and we make those distinctions, then we're able to understand what the Most High wants out of it. In particular, what the Most High wants is, when we set the Sabbath apart, is to sanctify that time so that it can be devoted to honoring and worshiping Him. But anyway, let's go to Matthew 12, 5, and I'll talk a little bit about the intent of the Father regarding the Sabbath in our setting apart that day to worship Him. It says in the 5th verse of the 12th chapter of Matthew, it says, "Or again, have you not read in the Torah," or the law as it's translated here, but it's Torah, "that on the Sabbath day the temple priests break the Sabbath without being blamed for it?" Now, Messiah uses this terminology about breaking the Sabbath because in the general sense, there is no work to be performed on Sabbath. But Messiah says they break the Sabbath and are not blamed for it. And the reason being is because when it comes to the activities of worship to the Almighty, it is permitted. And so we see this example here, that when it comes to things that involve the worship activity, it is permitted to perform work that involves worship. Now, any work that involves making money for yourself or taking care of your home or doing all of those things, the Most High said it is a day of ceasing, that you are not supposed to do your own thing on the Sabbath. And we talked about that too. How that in Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14, the Most High said that you are to refrain from doing what you want to do or doing your own thing on the Sabbath and treating the Sabbath as though it is not sacred. See, those are things that the Most High wanted to bring out. And the reason why these passages of scriptures are here in the scriptures is because those of the past did not treat the Sabbath with specialness. They didn't treat the Sabbath as though it was a special day. They did the same things like many people do today to try to come up with some reason as to why the Sabbath is either unnecessary, and many say, well, Yeshua, he fulfilled all the commandments, and so he's the fullness of the Sabbath, therefore we don't need to keep it anymore. So we'll do our own thing, the Most High understands. And then you have those that will basically do whatever they choose without looking at the parameters in the scriptures regarding keeping the Sabbath. They do what they want to do, as Isaiah 58:13-14. It says that they do what they want to do as the Sabbath and do not consider it a delight, something that is special. So it's important that we be mindful of how we view Sabbath, because the Most High himself, he himself regards that day as special. And as we look at another aspect of this, also on the Sabbath, we find that circumcision was performed on the Sabbath. In John chapter 7, verses 22-23, Messiah makes another statement there, and I'm going to read that just as well. And the issue had to do with whether a person should perform circumcision on the Sabbath or not, or should they perform it even if the 8th day of from a child's birth fell on the Sabbath. And so when we go to John chapter 7, verse 22 and verse 23, let's look at that. It says, Moses ordered you to practice circumcision, not that it began with him. It goes back to the patriarchs, and you circumcise on the Sabbath. Now, if a man can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the Torah of Moses is not broken, why are you angry with me for making a man whole and complete on the Sabbath? And so here, Messiah was just bringing up a point that it was an understood precept that if the 8th day from the birth of a male child occurred on the Sabbath, that circumcision was still supposed to take place. And so here we find an instance of another permitted thing that's allowed on the Sabbath. We also want to note that providing animals with care on the Sabbath was also an accepted practice. We look over in Luke. Let's go to Luke chapter 13, verse 15. And in the previous teachings that we did on this, we did speak a little bit about how that it was permitted for animals to be cared for on the Sabbath. Luke chapter 13, verse 15. And Luke chapter 13, verse 15, it says here in this passage, but the Lord answered him, hypocrites, he said, is there one of you who does not untie his ox or his donkey from the manger on the Sabbath and take it out for watering? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has held bound these 18 years, was it not right to untie her bonds on the Sabbath day? And so here what we have is a situation where Messiah, there again, he's using another example of how that as an accepted practice on the Sabbath, when an animal needed some water to drink or needed food to eat, that the owner of the animal would untie their animal to go and to get water to drink or food to drink on the Sabbath. And of course, Messiah was using this example to just show evidence of how that it is also acceptable in the eyes of the Most High. And it is something that is permitted in the eyes of the Most High, that healing should come upon those who might be sick. And if a person is sick on the Sabbath, then it is permitted that they receive healing, that they receive a cure on the Sabbath. But of course, here in what I'm dealing with right now has to do with animals being provided care on the Sabbath. Also, if we look at Luke chapter 14, verse 4, right over in the next chapter of Luke, we have another situation where the saving the life of an animal is permitted on the Sabbath. Let's look at this one here. And it says, and Yeshua addressed the lawyers and Pharisees. Is it against the law or the Torah, he asked, to cure a man on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. So he took the man and cured him and sent him on his way. Then, I want you to check this out. Then he said to them, which of you here, if his animal falls into a well, or his son, falls into a well, or his ox, will not pull him out on the Sabbath day without hesitation? And so, as I mentioned, it was an established practice then, if an animal fell into a pit, a big hole, that animal wouldn't be left in that hole. They would immediately go and bring that animal up out of the hole. And if they had to get ropes or whatever they had to do in order to make sure that they were getting that animal out of the hole, they would do whatever was necessary to preserve the life of the animal. Here again, Messiah was using an example, making the comparison of healing on the Sabbath, the saving of life, making one's life whole. He compares that to the established and acceptable practice of bringing care and the saving of the life of an animal, which was something that was done on the Sabbath. So when you have situations where it has to do with the saving of a person's life, providing care for an individual, it was perfectly permitted on the Sabbath. We also want to look at providing health care to people. And this is something that goes and ties right in line with what we've been talking about here and discussing. When we looked at the 4th and 5th verses of Luke chapter 14, verses 4 and 5, we saw here animal care, but we also saw the care for human life, because it says in that passage, which of you here, if his son falls into a pit? See, when it comes to the care of human life, the saving of human life, the administering of care to those who are sick, these things are permitted on the Sabbath. And so if it's all right to feed an animal, if it's all right to permit care on the Sabbath for animals, then it's perfectly fine to permit care for humans on the Sabbath. And Messiah was wanting to make this known, especially because in this particular era, you had a religious system that was so concerned about controlling the masses within the framework of Israel, instead of being concerned about their wholeness. And here we find Messiah not taking the Sabbath away, not doing away with any of the prohibitions that the Most High had made regarding the Sabbath, but he is simply making it clear that the Sabbath was created for the benefit of humankind, and that you keep the Sabbath within the parameters that the Most High gave. But if you have situations where human life is threatened and care needs to be provided, then it is expected that care be provided. And now, because of this particular concept, we believe that when doctors, those in the healthcare industry, work on Sabbath to provide care for people, that it is a permitted thing to provide care for human beings on the Sabbath. I would say, and someone might say, well, that's your opinion. Well, this would be my opinion based upon the scripture, that it's permitted to provide care for animals and humans on the Sabbath, that those who have careers in the health industry where it is needful for care to be maintained for those who are sick, that is permitted on the Sabbath. And of course, we've looked at some of the passages where Messiah uses the examples. In Luke 6, verses 6 through 10, we find a place where Messiah gives an example. We also read over in Luke 13, 14, and 15. We read that. Also in John chapter 7, verse 23, we made mention of that as well. But in these cases, we find that it is permitted to provide care for the health of human beings. And so in this particular instance, we believe that healthcare professionals are permitted to work on the Sabbath, and also in-home care that's provided to people in home, that is also permitted on the Sabbath, because the Most High is concerned about the care and the well-being and the health of human beings. And so in those particular instances, we find here from the wisdom of Messiah that it is permitted. And of course, they were taking care of animals during that time, making sure that the life of an animal would be cared for. How much more important is the life of a human being? And so we want to note that. The last point we want to look at here, and this point here is in Luke chapter 6. We're still in the book of Luke here. I haven't turned from it. But I want to go to Luke 6, and I want to read verses 1 through 5, because in this situation, this is where you have an instance of what is considered work or not. The Pharisees of that time, they had a whole list, an itemized list of things that they considered work. I mean, you couldn't even take a writing utensil and write on Sabbath. I mean, they had all of these guidelines of things that they considered work, that it was virtually impossible to keep Sabbath without, I guess, the only thing you could do was to just sit somewhere and do nothing, because in their understanding, they believe that anything you do that had any type of creativity or any type of creative activity was considered as being work on the Sabbath. Well, I think most of us, we pretty much know what laborious work is and what it is not. We really do. Sabbath was designed that we cease from the weekly work activity to take care of our living. Whether you have your own business or whether you work for someone else or whether you have a farm, you understand what work is. Ceasing from that and the resting and the enjoying of the day. But we had a situation where Messiah and his disciples, they were accused of working on the Sabbath. So here, we're going to go to Luke 6, 1 through 5. Luke 6, 1 through 5. And it says, now one Sabbath, he happened to be taking a walk through the cornfields or the grain fields. And it says, and his disciples were picking the ears of corn or the kernels of the grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. Some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing something that is forbidden on the Sabbath day? Yeshua answered them, so you have not read what David did when he and his followers were hungry, how he went into the house of God, took the loaves of offering and ate them and gave them to his followers. Loaves which only the priests are allowed to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, in this situation right here, Messiah and his disciples were on their way to the synagogue. This is basically where they were going. They were passing through the grain fields. You know, it probably was wheat or barley that they had plucked from the stalk, rubbed off the shell of it so that they could eat the kernels. It's no different if someone was to go into their backyard and pick a plum or a peach off the tree and then clean it up and eat it. There's a difference between going out into the grain field with your sickle and cutting down the stalks, all right, cutting it down and then making bundles out of it. But what we find here is that because the Pharisees were so meticulous in wanting to have their idea of how Sabbath was to be kept, they blamed everyone for doing some of the smallest things that didn't mean anything to the Most High. Because here you have the Most High in the flesh. You have Yahweh Eloheinu in the flesh, in the person of Yeshua, going through the grain fields and picking the kernels. The one who gave Torah, gave the prohibitions of Sabbath in the Torah, he's picking kernels from the grain stalk and eating it. See, here we have the mind of the Father here through the activity of Messiah Yeshua. So when we see what is permitted on the Sabbath, going into the backyard, picking yourself a piece of fruit, that's not considered as work. We who know what work is, we really understand what work is. And the Most High was not trying to give some long list of do's and don'ts about this is work, this is not work, this is work, this is not work. We know what work is that takes our time and attention away from focusing in on something where the Sabbath, and I want to say this before I wrap this up, the Sabbath is intended for us to enjoy and to relieve ourselves of the stress, the mental stress, the physical stress of work, in the taking care of things as we normally do from day to day, to be a time of enjoyment. If you want to exercise on the Sabbath, some people say, well, that's working out. That's sin to work out. For some, it's a joyous thing. But, of course, that's my opinion. The concept behind work has to do with those things that have to do with exertion, mental, physical exertion, where it takes away from the enjoyment, the rest, the relaxation. And the other thing I wanted to mention about on Sabbath, while we're shifting our minds from working, not only physically, but mentally. Sometimes not sometimes, you have to take a mental check out from work and the things that you have to do so that you can have Sabbath, a ceasing. See, this is what the Most High desires. And the reason being is because the Most High set Sabbath apart, and he said that it is to be a holy convocation, a set apart time for gathering. So not only are we to prepare ourselves both mentally and physically in a way that we cease from doing what we normally would do during the work week, but we shift our minds to worship and to fellowship, an initial intended by intention. We are focusing our attention to fellowship with the Most High. That's the whole reason for the day being set apart as a holy convocation, as well as a day of ceasing from activity, because that's the main intent. Well, the Most High be praised. We trust that you have been blessed in hearing the teaching on how to keep the Sabbath, part 3. I trust that it has been presented in such a way where you've been able to understand the teaching and to really come to grips with the fact that the Sabbath is not something that is a bondage to those of us who are believers, but the Most High gave it as a blessing to mankind, where Yeshua said that man was not made for the Sabbath, but that the Sabbath was made for man. It is a blessing for man. It is the gift that the Most High has given to us, where we learn how to de stress from the work week, learn to rest, and shift our attention to the Most High so that we can connect with Him and also connect with the people of faith just as well. And for those of you who are watching for the first time, I trust that the teaching has made sense to you. And if you're interested in other things that we have to offer, I'd like to invite you to go to our website at www.ncmmi.20m.com. You can go there and to view our links that we have and check out some of the things that we have to offer. If there are some who are interested in being trained in the ministry, we have a School of Messiah Bible Institute, which is designed specifically for ministry training. And another thing that I would really like to put out there for those of you who have a heart for the orphans is our ministry called Ministry to the Orphans, where we provide packages of clothing and also academic resources to send out to the various pastors in some of the countries where we have pastors that are in covenant relationship with us in our fellowship. And in those places, such as some of the African countries, such as Uganda, Kenya, in Sierra Leone, and also in other places such as India. We are doing what we can based upon the resources that the Most High provides to be a blessing and to send out packages to the orphans. And you can help us tremendously by going to our website and donating on our website where we have our donation button. It helps us to be able to give and to make a difference to the lives of those children that are in need. Well, I trust that everything that you have been able to hear through the teaching and receive has been a blessing to you. And we thank you so much for listening to us. And hopefully you'll tune in again and hear the teaching from Voice of Messiah Ministries. Be blessed. Shalom.